Hi, and welcome to Classic Advice. My name is Scarlett Classic. I am your host. This is my podcast all about my advice that I'd like to share with you. I also have co-hosts on, and they bring their own unique experience and expertise to the show, which is awesome. So I'm so happy that you decided to join, and let's dive right into the episode. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up that, one, the sound quality is a little bit different in this one. I had to do this recording in the camper, and I was cold. There's a storm outside, so if you hear rain right now in the background, that's real rain. That's not sound added from Storyblocks. So, yeah, and the furnace kicked on. So I'm sorry about the background noise, but I have a amazing co-host on with me today. And typically on Wednesdays when we get together and we have our little chats, it's more, even with my other co-hosts, it's more of a closer look, that one-on-one, how can we deal with our anger? How can we reset our mindset for more positivity in our lives? How can we deal with the hardships, and how do we cope with our grief, and all of that stuff that's very personal and in that one-on-one. But in this episode, me and my co-hosts, we take a step back. We took a trip. We're up in the space station, and we're looking down on the planet as a whole, as a nation as a whole, as different countries, and a more broader view, so to speak, instead of being really close up and on the ground. I really hope that you guys enjoy this episode. I know I did. I learned something about elephants today. Oh, that's intriguing. Yeah, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Classic Advice. I hope you had a wonderful week. I have a surprise for you guys. It's Friday, and that means I have a co-host here with me. I have David Beckemeyer here. David, why don't you introduce everybody to yourself and tell them about your show?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm David Beckemeyer, as we noted, and I'm a former tech guy and was in that for many years, and then I took this leap into science journalism, we'll say. And I have this podcast now called Outrage Overload, so it's way outside my comfort zone. I've been doing it for a couple of years now. And it's funny that I say Outrage Overload, and I have to say that clearly because often people hear Outrage Overlord for some reason, so that happens a lot. So I take that. I'll take it. I'll be the Outrage Overlord. But yeah, the actual podcast is Outrage Overload. So yeah, it's about outrage in society, outrage in politics, and kind of trying to figuring out ways to lower the temperature out there.
Yeah, that's quite the mission, and I love it. I love it because there is a lot of negativity in the world, and I was listening to your show, and I was just, my heart swelled for you because in episode 43, you asked your guest if there was anything out there giving him hope, and his reply was your podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
Like, wow. That's so great.
Yeah, I have to say the folks in this space, it's sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, bridge building. People are doing research in this work. They seem to get it right away. So whatever I've done, I've messaged to that group really well. Now, I get a lot of other people, marketing people and others that say, your website's terrible, your messaging's awful, you got to figure out how to get a wider audience. But I'm messaging that group, they get it, but, yeah, so I probably have a lot of room to improve all that stuff. But they seem to get it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, too, it's just people are angry and they like being angry. They might not say it in those words, but they enjoy the fight. They want to fight. They get a thrill out of it or a kick out of it. So in cases like that, it's like I don't know how to reach them.
Right, that's one of the challenges. And I was in that place too, right? I mean, that was kind of part of my journey to even start investigating this, and because I was that guy out there getting in Twitter fights and all that stuff, and and then kind of realizing that this is not this is a bad, it's a negative spiral. And but yeah, and then in this journey I've really learned more about that, right? Like some of that is it gives us a reinforcement for our sort of moral decisions that we made. It makes us feel better about deciding the other side is evil. So we sort of want to see somebody showing us that the other side is evil, and we don't want to fact check that because we already want to believe it. So if it fits that narrative, we like it and we want more of it, even though it makes us mad. So I mean, and I see that a lot with even with listeners that have taken that first step. It's like, oh yeah, maybe I will check this out a little bit. But you see, even those listeners, fall into that. Some do, and because it is so hard for us to realize that we're doing it. It's kind of the forest for the trees thing. I think that when you're doing it yourself, it's a little bit difficult to see, and and so that's something I've certainly found out, that we do seek that media out and that kind of information out because it does validate us in many ways, and it can be you have to be very sort of intentional to try to avoid it, and it's also kind of it's against our sort of innate psychology, right? So you have to actually be pretty intentional about it and keep the sort of front part of your brain active.
Yeah, and just I like one of your guests that you had on called it negativity addiction, and when I heard that, I was like, I can see that 100% because it's. I don't know what it is about it, but he was talking, or she was talking, I can't remember, but how it's just it just draws us in and sucks us in when it's like, oh look, this person broke up, or this person did that, or if you're talking politics, oh look what the right side's doing versus the left side, or it just yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a fundamental phenomenon in humans. I think the technical term is negativity bias, where we weigh the negative much higher than the positive in our brain. And so the theory is that it has to do with our evolutionary biology, that's kind of what we had to do to keep ourselves alive, right?
Right, yeah.
What are you going to pay attention to? The lion, maybe that's a lion in the bushes, but maybe it's just a rabbit. But, you probably want to factor that it might be a lion, so I'm going to do this other thing that's not the rabbit one, and so we really pay attention to these negative things, and there's even more. It's interesting. There's even more negative adjectives in the dictionary than there are positive, so it shows how we, even in our language, we have bias to the negative.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, that's
there's something for your trivia night.
You're right. Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting, and I like how when they talked about it, like you said, it comes from an evolutionary standpoint where, yeah, we had to pay attention to the negative for our survival, but in today's day and age, I mean, yes, you have some countries or some situations where you might be thrown into survival mode, but for the most part, your day to day, you're not. And it's that it just draws you in because it's instinct to pay attention to it, because the positive stuff isn't going to be a threat because it's positive.
Yeah, I mean, you can see this in very simple terms, right? If you think about like a performance review at your work, right? You get 5 things that say, oh, you were, above average, or you were excellent, and you get the one that says needs improvement. Well, what's the one that you obsess over, right?
Yeah.
You kind of just completely ignore the other 5.
Yeah, 100%. And I've trained, like, I'm not a professional dog trainer, but I have 5 of my own dogs. I've trained lots of dogs. I've trained my parents' dogs, yada, yada. And the thing that trainers will do is if you scold your dog once, you have to give them 10 times the amount of positive affection after that. Otherwise, they'll sulk, they'll get depressed, and they won't trust you because they think that you're just mad at them all the time. So even from a dog's canine perspective, they do it too. They really pay attention to the negative side of things. So I guess the reason, or one of the reasons why we might have such a hard time with trying to keep the peace, so to speak, is because we're so drawn to that negative, and it takes 10 times as much effort to really focus and shift our mindset to stay positive.
Yeah, it really does. It takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of attention. And I talk about this a lot on the show, that like if you're going to watch the news or whatever, watch with this lens, because there's so much of this negative. They know it works. They know they know about these emotions. They know how this works. Mm-hmm. So that you've got the sensational headlines. You've got stories where, they're not necessarily telling lies, like but they're just leaving stuff out, or they're just exaggerating it, or whatever. And so when you're watching the news, just remember that they're trying to do that all the time. Mm-hmm. And so kind of keep things in that lens, even if it's, or I should say, especially if it's sort of folks that you see as kind of on your side, because it's very easy to be critical of the other side. That's kind of we want to be that, because like I say, we want to feel like we picked the right side. Mm-hmm. So we want to find those critiques of the other side, but we don't tend to critique our own side enough, and we need to be much more calling our own side out when they're doing this stuff. And I think you saw a little bit of language around this recently with some of the events that have happened here, and people talking about, toning down the rhetoric and that kind of thing. But, it kind of starts with us. Like, we're the ones who go seek it out, and we let them have the benefit of the clicks or our likes or our attention, or they're watching their shows or whatever. So it's really up to us to start calling it out and start, even tuning it out sometimes, or finding a different source, or taking a break, or whatever. But even if you are going to stay engaged, really keep that attention up, that kind of media is being thrown at you, and and just expect it, and be like, there's sort of an inoculation to a degree that you can just keep that lens up, that they are sending you this kind of. So ask yourself a lot of the time, does that sound right? Does that sound a little fishy? Are they telling me the full story? That seems a little bit odd. Like, if it's really, really over the top, maybe they're not telling you the full story, or maybe they've done a cut on that clip that they showed, that they left some of the context out, or something that frames it much worse than it really is. And I think that's what you have to be aware of, because they're doing that a lot, where they're kind of putting everything in this negative frame if they can.
Oh yeah, a very good example of that. I'm up in Canada, during COVID, there was a big trucker convoy strike in Ottawa, which was like made the news. You probably heard about it. And I knew people that were there, and they told me it's like a big party. They were feeding all the homeless people. They were shopping at the vendors. It was basically one big party. There was nothing violent about it. And there was this one group that wasn't behaving themselves, and that's all the news was reporting. But then you went on TikTok and you would see the other side of the frame, and it'd be like, okay, yeah, there's these people, but look at all of these people, because they just didn't pan it. So it's, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's not good news. Like, nobody wants to go on to turn on Fox News and watch a bunch of people getting along. Nobody
right?
wants that.
Yeah. So it's, yeah, being I guess aware of that, and something that they taught us in high school, I remember, was critical thinking, and we need to carry that forward, I think, and be critical of your own side too. Like, don't be scared to be wrong, I guess, if you are wound up. And it's hard, I get it, when you have certain views, and yeah. Well,
yeah, and there's a lot of psychology about that. One of the social psychologists, I can't remember her name now, has kind of her E equals MC squared sort of thing about sociology, or social science or social psychology is, that the fear of social death is greater than the fear of physical death. And so, like, you just used the term, don't be afraid to be wrong. Well, what happens is we get in these tribes, and it becomes our identity, and we get ideologically attached to it. And then we are really afraid of being wrong, because it's now part of our identity. And that we have to get better about not caring about being wrong, right? And it can be hard to do that. Like, if you ask me certain questions, if I asked you how many species of elephant there are, like, I don't know if that's something you'd be really emotionally attached to if you got that wrong.
2, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, the Asians and Africans.
Okay, so how confident are you in that answer?
Not on a scale very, of 1 to because 10? I really don't know my elephants.
So what would you give it on a scale of 1 to 10?
Oh, maybe a 7.
Oh, okay. That's pretty confident. Yeah, the actual answer is 3.
Oh.
But as you said, and so now that you were wrong, like, how does that make you feel?
I want to know what
And
the other elephant is.
right. You want to you feel like you got smarter, right?
Yeah.
But if you were ideologically attached to it, like that's the feeling we want. Like if if everything we could do, we could actually have that same lack of care about the truth of it.
Yeah.
Like everything would be so much better. But it's so hard to do that because you get emotionally attached to the outcome on this. So yeah. So the thing is now there used to be like the Indian and the African elephant. Now there's 2 variations of African elephants. And again, species are an interesting thing about this as well, because that's something like if you get into the science denier kind of world, the species idea is perfect because it's changing all the time, right? And so it's the best science people have now. They look at things and they've categorized it this way. Could change. That doesn't necessarily mean we were really wrong before. It was the best information that we were going with, and that's the way we we looked at the world. But anyway, it's a good example of also being okay that things are a little fluid.
Yeah.
But yeah. But that's one thing, is that if we could be that not concerned about being wrong, and it's important to be able to put that number on it, by the way, because that makes a second part of your brain gets activated when you have to think about how confident I am in this answer, because it makes you think about the rationale that about the answer I gave. So if you're going to talk to people, and again, I don't recommend necessarily people changing minds, but if you just want to understand their position a little better, it can help people to understand their own take on it, and it works for you as well, that you'll get a better sense of your understanding of your position if you have to explain it, right? I forget what that's called, but there's a actual formal terminology for it. But if you have to explain your position, or you try to explain your position to someone, out of the, not necessarily in a biased way, but just it's like someone that's open-minded and wants to hear your explanation, about whatever. If you can't explain it, then that's going to probably lower your confidence, right? Like maybe I don't know it as well as I thought I knew it. I mean, the classic example is things like zippers. Like, how does a zipper work? And people, I don't know, I use zippers every day. And you say, okay, well, like draw how a zipper works or describe how a zipper works, right? Most of us can't do it, even though we use a zipper every day. And so it's that kind of thing where we kind of realize that we think we know more than we do. And when we have to go explain it, we sort of understand, oh, yeah, maybe I do still have something to learn about this.
Yeah. 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 And when it gets hard, when you have a debate of something that that people get so passionate about because they have that 100% confidence of, no, this is the right way to do it, or whether that be it's backed by science or it's backed by what they believe as a religion, or right when you get into that moral side of things, like for example, should abortion be legalized? Ooh, that's a really big topic to touch on, because you get people that are on the far right, and then you get the people that are on the far left, and it's to get them to come into a room and talk to each other, to not to talk, to try to empathize with the other side, to try to understand where they're coming from, but not to speak to them in a way like someone mentioned on your show before. Don't speak to someone because you want to change their mind. Speak to them because you actually just want to see their point of view.
Like, how did they come to see the world that way, right? And
Yeah.
try to understand that better. And in doing that, you'll understand your position better. And the other thing, if you do want to be an advocate, understanding those on the other side's perspective is how you're going to be a better advocate, because you're going to understand how they got there. And if you just go blind in and tell people they're wrong, obviously you're not going to get anywhere that way. But if you understand more about their position, if you are an advocate, if you want to be an advocate of some kind, you're going to have better chances if you come in to it understanding a little bit, having some empathy for their position and how people think that way. And and I think those kind of talks, like a lot of people say those kind of talks are a waste of time, like if you're that far apart you can't talk or whatever. And I think a lot of these organizations that are out there having these conversations, they're really showing you can talk. They're not, most of those organizations, some are, some aren't, but for the most part they're not really trying to even have people necessarily find common ground. They're trying more or less to find kind of common humanity and better understanding of these opposing viewpoints, or just different viewpoints, not even opposing sometimes. They're just kind of, because often we frame these things as two sides, but really, There's many more nuanced positions on some of these things than you might think, and you don't really understand that until you kind of get out of your bubble and talk to some other folks. In some of these organizations that are conducting these kind of conversations, they do it with moderators and things like that. So it's sort of, and they have some ground rules. So these kind of conversations are not always the best, like in a grocery store with somebody you don't know very well, or in that kind of a situation, because the participants have to be there in good faith and ready to play by the rules. And so, but I think these organizations are showing you can have these kind of difficult conversations. I recently moderated a conversation on gun laws, which is, the same kind of thing where people get very passionate about it, but also there's a lot of misperceptions and people sort of making a lot of assumptions about people on the quote unquote other side. And then you come to find out, there's kind of more than two sides of this thing to begin with. There's people kind of all over the place on some of this. And so, and until you get out there and have those conversations, it's not clear, right? Because you're getting a version of this sort of boiled down to simple 5-minute or 2-minute sound bites. And, it's obviously you're not going to get the nuance in those 2-minute sound bites.
Yeah. And for our listeners that are listening, like you could apply this to your relationships too. Like it doesn't have to be just concerning politics or whatever, because we were just talking about politics. But even when you said moderator, I was thinking, in the lawyer office, if a couple is trying to work things out in counseling, you can apply all of these things that we were just talking about, like trying to understand the other side, having some empathy, and not getting so hung up on I'm right and you're wrong. This was black and white. There can be gray. Gray exists.
There almost always is gray.
Yeah. And like even just thinking about my relationship with my own husband, like we're two completely different people. Night and day as night and day is. So of course we're going to have times where we disagree. And then I was coming from the standpoint where it was like, we shouldn't fight ever. Like, I don't want to have that in my relationship. And he's like, well, no, like we're two different people. We're going to fight. Like, let's fight. Let's have it out. And then we'll be better. And then we can move on with our night. And it was a very different way of looking at it than I had looked at it before. But yeah, like we can have an argument, or we can have a heated discussion, if you may, and still love each other at the end. Still, because he really tries to see things from my point of view, and then vice versa. I really try to see where he was coming from. I may not agree that it was right or that he should have done so, or me, right? But we still try to have that empathy and understand each other from the other side. And then at the end of the day, if it's like, well, we agree to disagree, and that's what it is, it's okay. Right. And we live in the same house. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that's when it was hard to agree to disagree when something becomes sort of a moral, fundamental value sort of thing in your mind. So that can be a little harder, but if you understand how people got there and you can see that they're bringing their values and morals, and there's overlap in those values and morals, you can do better. You can get closer to that and hopefully get to that point. And on most issues, when you really boil down to it, it's not that hard to do at all. But there's always a few of those ones where it feels like it's crossing a line to even agree to disagree. But I mean, at least even if you do find those, and again, I think those can be extremely rare. What we're doing now is kind of making everything like that. Like if you just like the wrong thing that's not even that important, I suddenly can't like you at all in any way, and you're an evil person, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we're just getting out of control. And on my show, a lot of these are in the context of sort of politics, because in the U.S. that's kind of where we're at right now, where there's just this kind of toxic division, and it's very bitter.
And you have an election coming up. So
and we have an election coming up, so things are heating up even more, and and the whole, and that ramps up every time, because all these things come bubbling back up when the election season is coming in, and and so there's so many parts. So that our show we kind of talk in the context of these political divides, but you're absolutely right. I mean, this stuff applies equally, in relationships, and many of the psychologists and others that I have on the show kind of see the toxic polarization in our country as a relationship problem. It's very similar to a family therapy sort of issue, right? It's a lot of the same kinds of things going on, just at this, collective scale. But yeah, it totally overlaps with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of your guests had mentioned that mental maturity is lacking. People coming from broken homes. I think she was a psychologist or something. And she talked about all of that. And it was fascinating because, yeah, if you look at the country, even Canada too, like, well, really any country, but we're all a little bit broken, but we don't necessarily know we're broken. So we can't fix it if we don't know what's broken. Your car's clunking
Right.
down the road, but you don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big problem as well. That many of these symptoms we see, or these effects that we see, like when you just roll it back and roll it back and roll it back, ultimately it's about fear, and it's about control, and it's about these fundamental human needs and concerns. And it often comes about from something like that, some kind of a trauma that occurred at some point. But it's very hard. You can't just walk up to someone and, well, you're acting like that because you were traumatized, right? How has that ever worked for anyone?
No, I doubt it.
So you can't do that, and so it's a challenge because most of us, have probably something going on that we don't even really know is happening, and many times those are the underlying drivers for some of these behaviors that we see, and we have almost like a collective malaise going on this regard, that you find people kind of becoming susceptible to some of these populist ideas and some more extreme ideas because of these underlying, mental health issues.
Yeah. Well, even thinking back to like Nazi Germany, right? And how he used negativity to completely just wipe out millions. And people went along with it because all the propaganda, and I mean, that's a whole other, we could talk about that for hours, but it was also drawn on negativity and people's anger and getting them all hyped up and then giving them a scapegoat, and then they just followed.
Yeah, and that's a good example of how a lot of us in this space, are so passionate about it, and why you see so many scientists, researchers, other kind of practitioners really taking this seriously, because that's kind of thing that you could see. This is the we're kind of at this boiling point. We're kind of some kind of a powder keg that's ready to blow. A lot of people can see we've got all those signs are there, and so this is a really important problem to be working on right now. And I'm working on an interview now that I'm editing, and that won't be out in a while. But and that person has been involved. Guy Burgess has been involved in this kind of bridge building, depolarization work for decades, and he makes the pitch that it's as big a problem for the world as climate change is, because we are at this powder keg sort of state, and and it's easy to kind of ignore it, and it's great if you have the privilege to kind of ignore it. That's cool. I'm not saying don't have to get involved if you don't want to. But the reality is still out there, whether you're kind of off on TikTok doing your own thing or not. I'm not saying you're a bad person for doing that, but the reality is still there, right? And it's great that a lot of people have the privilege to kind of ignore it, but it really is out there, and that's why so many people are taking it so seriously, because they really see that this, that many of the signs are there, and we're that close, to this blowing up in bad ways around the world, and so so that's why so many people are looking at this problem, and that's one reason that I have some hope that some of the best brains we have are kind of looking at this and working on it, and there's so many people concerned about it, and I think you're going to start seeing more attention paid to this, and more people realizing that while it was it's cool to get your clicks and your likes, there are downsides to impact. These have people, these impact real people. I think you're seeing this among influencers, that influencers can be sort of have a toxic wake behind them, right? And I think you're seeing a lot of this. I think the news media, all these things. I mean, we're gonna have to be really, there's gonna have to be some changes in in this model, and I think you're starting to see it, and I think that what it's going to take is a movement, and I think we're seeing that build. So I'm encouraged by that I think a lot of people are starting to really see this, and we just have to figure out how to make it a fun populist movement to save the planet from toxic polarization.
Right.
Yeah, and it's like you say, it's something you have to kind of have that lens for, so that you kind of know what's happening, and then you kind of go, well, wait a minute, let's take it down a notch and think about this for a minute. But a lot of the stuff that's like that is much less than that. Like, it's just one guy in, sometimes these are 10,000 miles away in some foreign country did a thing, and the news will pump that up like, this is happening everywhere. It's like, no, it's one guy in this one country did this one thing one time.
Yeah.
And, and it's very hard to sometimes step back and say, oh, yeah, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm. Well, and talking about polarity too, a lot of, like when I lived abroad, a lot of arguments that I had with people were because I was doing something in a way that wasn't considered right by their cultural standards, but it wasn't by my cultural standards. So even and I lived in Eastern Europe, which isn't even that, I mean, it's different, don't get me wrong, but there's countries that are even more severely different culturally speaking, like Africa and the Middle East and China. Like, their cultures are even more extremely different, right? Like, I went to Guatemala and they told us, don't ever take your shoes off in the house. Don't do that. And I was 15 on a mission trip, and we're like, why? And they're like, because it'd be like going into someone's house and taking off all your clothes. Do not take your shoes off when you go into someone's house. As a Canadian, you're American, so maybe you don't know this about us Canadians. We Canadians always take off our shoes because it's considered rude if you don't.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah, there's a big pile of shoes by the front door all the time, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, we try to have shoe racks. My shoe rack's broken, but
yeah.
So
yeah,
even,
it's
even
like,
things like that.
If you're in Italy, what's the line? Every chef is wanting to commit suicide when people order a cappuccino with their meal. It's like, wait, what? Okay, because you don't know all these little weird protocol things, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I guess we've pretty much talked about all the stuff we talked about talking about.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Yeah,
well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think the big thing is to, I think the chill pill at the end is the way to think about it. Like try to take a step back more often than not. Like, if your first reaction is to get amped up and you feel that emotion coming on, that's probably the main time to be thinking about taking that step back. You talked earlier about kind of giving yourself a timeout. That may be the time to give yourself a timeout. If you feel that blood boiling and you want to really get into it, that's probably a good indication that A, you might be being manipulated, and B, probably time to take a step back and see if there's more to this story.
Yeah, there's always two sides of a coin. There's always two sides of a story. And yeah, I guess being open-minded enough to be prepared to be wrong, and that's okay. And some answers, like, we may never know, like there's some things that we're just, if you think back a couple hundred years, there was so much that we know now that they didn't know then. So give it another couple hundred years and they'll be looking at us like, haha, look at these guys. They got all ramped up about this, and look, it wasn't even an issue.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess in closing, just to be aware that negativity can be an addiction. If you have that one friend that's constantly finding things that are wrong, or constantly just overall in a negative mindset, that they might be addicted to negativity, and it's not their fault. We're evolved to be this way, and you can see them in a different light now, and to be, I guess, empathetic towards them, towards you, if you find out that you're wrong, and just trying to understand the other side, of things, and yeah, that anger being linked to a sense of loss of control, and I guess trying not necessarily to control the things that you can't, but focus on the things that you can control, and regain a little bit of your control back. Well, we'll give you that little that sense of control over your day, over your life, and can bring your anger level down. And yeah, put yourself in a timeout like I do. It works. It really does. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David Beckemeyer, for coming on. It was a real pleasure, a real joy. I hope you come back. This was a lovely conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Scarlett. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, before we close off, tell everybody again about your podcast and where we can find you. I'll put links in the show notes. As always, you are already on the website, so if you go onto my website and you scroll down to co-host, you'll see David there. You can click on his photo and it'll direct you to his website, and his podcast is on there too. So
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so the show is Outrage Overload, and Scarlett, as you know, us podcasters, we love to get feedback. So we really, even if it's bad or even if it's any kind of feedback, we love hearing from listeners about all kinds of things. So if you're able to listen to a half an episode at 5 seconds and you say this thing's ridiculous, I still want to get that feedback. I'd love to hear from you. So yeah, if you're able to check it out and give me some feedback, I'm easy to find. All my contact info is on there on the website, but it's outrageoverload@gmail.com is also a quick way to send me an email. But you can pretty much find me on all the Twitters and all those things. So easy to find.
Awesome. Yeah, and he has a lot of experts on his show that are really, really fascinating. So if you need to bring your blood temperature down, then go have a listen. Alrighty. Well, you take care, David. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. And that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you for listening all the way to the very end. Aw, you're the best. My website is ClassicChronicles.ca. If you want to head on over there, I have my co-hosts all listed there. If you click on their photos, it'll take you directly to their website. Go say hi to them. They would love to hear from you. Podcasters love hearing from their listeners. So go say hi. Don't be shy. And if you want to as well, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link on there, which all the proceeds I use to just pour right back into my podcast. It does cost me just a little bit to have this podcast going, and I would love to be able to support it instead of taking it out of my own pocket and maybe, take the kids for an ice cream because they don't like coffee. I love coffee though. So, all right, you guys take care and we'll see you next week. Bye.